ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. See, these are great for still photography, but when it comes to cinematography, where a consistent look is important and constraints are introduced for aesthetics, sticking to that old system as your rule of thumb can hurt you. The system you now need to go by is literal light, ND filters, and your grade. Kind of. But before I get into those, let's go over why the old system may not be in the best interest of you. ISO. Here's a shot at 1250 ISO, and here's a shot at 4000 ISO. Now, if we take a look at the false color readings of the previous examples, at 1250 ISO, you'll notice all of the sky showing yellow, telling you there's no detail there because you have less overall stops of light in the highlights. At 4000 ISO, you'll see you do get more detail in the brightest areas as it graduates from gray to yellow to red. That's because at 4000 ISO, at least for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, you have more stops of dynamic range in the highlights. So as you change the ISO, you change how many stops of light is allocated in each tonal range. So take a look at your camera's dynamic range chart. It'll be unintuitive at first, but once you get the gist of it and you put it into practice, you'll understand it a lot more. So you're in a bright scene, shooting outside, or even shooting towards a window. If you don't care about seeing what's in the highlights, by all means feel free to explore using a lower ISO. However, if you want to see the details, see the distinction between the sky and the clouds, you may want to use a higher ISO for that. Now, detail in this sense doesn't necessarily mean sharpness or lack of noise, but rather discernible values of light among the tonal range. Same goes for the other end of the spectrum. So if you're shooting a dark scene, you may want to use a lower ISO to grab more details, aka discernible values of light in the shadow tonal range. And if you just wanted to fall and clip into darkness, use a higher ISO. Also note, if you're using a camera with a dual gain ISO or dual native ISO, using the lowest ISO setting on the second gain circuit can be a better starting off point than going straight to ISO 100. Nevertheless, knowing how ISO affects the dynamic range, you may not want to reach for it immediately if you're trying to preserve the most amount of detail in your shadow or highlight range. Alright, shutter speed. Now, you've all been told that having a 180-degree shutter is, most naturalistic to the human eye. I'm not here to debate that, but if you're shooting in a bright scene and you want to take down the exposure, taking the shutter speed and decreasing it is going to affect how choppy the footage looks. Now, don't get me wrong, this can 100% be used for a stylistic or dramatic effect. For example, in a lot of fight scenes, you'll see that the shutter speed is cranked to make the movement look a lot more faster and intense, and vice versa for, something more dreamy or drunk or soap opera looking. The shutter speed is slowed or the shutter angle is increased to give the movement more exaggeration or to give it more of a smeary look. The effects that you get when changing your shutter are things that you should be wary of. So again, may not be something you want to reach for immediately when filming a scene. Newest and biggest craze in town, using a wide open aperture, large format or full frame sensor to get the shallowest depth of field in your shots. But Ian, you might say, opening up the iris also increases exposure. This is true. No lies were told. So if you're trying to go for a shallow depth of field look and you end up overexposed, closing down the iris isn't always an option for you. Vice versa, if you try and go for a deeper depth of field and you're underexposed, opening up the iris may not be an option for you either. And this is where we get to our new exposure triangle. Light, ND filters, and your grade. Again, kind of. So take for example, you're shooting in a dark scene. You want to maintain as many details in the shadow region as possible, so use a lower ISO setting. Say you're still too underexposed. What do? Well, add light. You actually need to light your scenes with something sometimes, even if it's a dark night scene. And just because you have a low light camera does not mean you have a no light camera, so please add light to your scenes. So for another example, say you're shooting in a bright scene and you want to maintain as many details in the highlight region, so you're using a higher ISO. You also want to have a shallower depth of field, so your aperture is wide open and your shot is now overexposed. What do? Well, if your scene is being lit with artificial sources, you can just turn them down or turn them off. But the easiest option overall is to simply just tack on some ND filters on the front of your lens to bring down the exposure back to a normal value for you. Now, say you're shooting a scene and it's neither bright nor is dark, or you're just flat out indecisive. Just expose the shot how you normally would and allow it to be altered in your grade. Now, all cameras have some play with how much you could change exposure and color grading. You may end up revealing more noise when trying to make things brighter, and you may not be able to bring the highlights down in a natural looking way. So knowing the limits of your camera and what changes you could make to the footage after the fact, and being able to export that as a viewing LUT can and will help you astronomically on set when exposing your shot. After all, exposure isn't just trying to get your subject to middle gray, but rather making the decision whether you even want your subject or the scene for that fact anywhere near middle gray. So at that point, how your exposure looks visually is just as important as how correct the exposure is, because it, just like everything else in film, is subjective. But yeah, that's your new exposure triangle. If you learned something new, let me know down in the comments, as well as let me know how you're going to apply this to your next shoot. This was Lighting Tips with Ian, and I hope to see you soon. Peace.